It was the spring of 1944. The humid, salt-scented air clung to the jungle like a shroud, and the low sun cast jagged shadows across the uneven terrain. Somewhere on a small Pacific island, the distant echoes of war rolled across the hills like thunder. Japanese forces, relentless and seemingly unstoppable, were preparing a massive Banzai charge. 3,000 soldiers, eyes alight with fury, hearts beating as one, ready to crash over the island's defenses. Yet amidst this maelstrom of steel, discipline, and raw aggression, one man stood alone. Not a soldier, not a hero forged by the rigor of army drills or the scent of gunpowder. Just a civilian, clutching a firearm that the military would have laughed at. A gun deemed too small to matter. The wind rattled the sparse foliage, and somewhere, a bird took flight, unaware of the violence about to unfold below. The civilian crouched behind a small rock outcropping, knuckles white, breath shallow. Every step, every movement of the approaching soldiers could be heard. Boots stomping in perfect unison, voices chanting a chorus of war cries, a tide of human determination sweeping across the battlefield. Time itself seemed to slow. The gun, fragile in his hands, might as well have been a whisper in the storm. And yet in that fragile whisper lay the fate of hundreds. The first wave hit like a tidal surge, a living wall of fury and discipline. The ground itself seemed to shake as hundreds of Japanese soldiers poured over the ridge, boots striking earth in perfect unison, rifles glinting under the pale morning sun. Their war cries, a chorus of unrelenting rage, echoed across the hills, a sound that would have sent seasoned veterans scrambling for cover. Yet amidst this thunderous advance, one figure crouched silently behind a jagged outcropping of volcanic rock, his small handgun trembling lightly in his hands. He was not trained in the art of war. He had never been on a battlefield, never faced an enemy so vast and coordinated. He was a civilian, ordinary. In the hands of any officer or drill sergeant, his weapon would have been dismissed as a joker, a too small firearm incapable of inflicting serious damage on a disciplined army. Yet there he was, staring down the tide of human fury, the very embodiment of improbable courage. The first shot cracked the morning air, a single, sharp report that seemed almost inaudible against the roar of the charge, yet it carried a weight far beyond its size. A soldier, the first in the endless line, stumbled forward, gripping his chest in disbelief before collapsing into the dirt. The second shot followed with surgical precision, striking another in the neck, throwing him violently sideways. Each pull of the trigger was measured, deliberate, almost ritualistic, a rhythm in the chaos. Despite the smallness of the weapon, the bullets found their marks as if guided by some unseen force. The advancing soldiers faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the impossible to take root in their minds. One man, one fragile, civilian man standing against them, and yet he held the line. Time stretched unnaturally in those first minutes. The ordinary became extraordinary with every heartbeat, every measured breath. The civilian shifted slightly, feeling the sweat trickle down his forehead and into his eyes, blurring the edges of the battlefield. The scent of wet earth, smoke, and gunpowder mingled with the tang of salt from the nearby ocean, creating a sensory haze that threatened to overwhelm him. He forced himself to focus, hand steady, finger tight against the trigger. Behind him, the trees swayed gently in the wind, almost mocking the violence about to unfold. The enemy surged forward, bayonets glinting, faces twisted in fury, yet with each step, the momentum slowed, disrupted by a force they could not comprehend. For the first time, hesitation appeared among the soldiers. A brief flicker of doubt, that spread like wildfire through the ranks. They had not been trained for this, had not been prepared to face a single human obstacle in the midst of their disciplined charge. The civilian's mind raced, yet remained startlingly calm. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to abandon this hopeless stand, yet something deeper. The raw, unyielding will to survive, to protect what he held dear, rooted him firmly in place. He fired again, the small gun barking twice in rapid succession, each shot met with a gasp, a stumble, a body hitting the ground. The first soldier to fall had been the beginning, the second a pattern, the third, the fourth. Each impact a punctuation in the narrative of defiance that he was writing with sweat, courage, and lead. The soldiers around him began to hesitate, a ripple of uncertainty spreading from one face to the next. The unified tide of the Banzai, once so confident and unstoppable, began to crack in tiny, imperceptible ways. And yet it was far from over. The wave was still vast, still immense, still screaming forward. But now, for the first time, the enemy faced a question they could not answer. How could one man, armed with something so insignificant, hold back 3,000 trained soldiers? The landscape itself seemed to bear witness to the struggle. Dust kicked up by the advancing feet hung in the golden morning light, swirling in chaotic patterns around the civilian's position. The jagged rocks that provided cover were smeared with mud and leaves from the ongoing assault, each one a fortress and a tomb in equal measure. The soundscape was brutal, the sharp cracks of rifles, the unrelenting war cries, the thud of bodies hitting the earth, the metallic clink of falling weapons, all layered upon the low hum of the wind through the trees. And yet, amidst the cacophony, the civilian's breaths remained steady, his resolve unbroken. He was invisible in the chaos, a ghost woven into the rhythm of the battlefield. Each shot was precise, almost intimate, despite the scale of destruction unfolding around him. The enemy did not merely falter. They paused, glanced at each other, exchanged confused, terrified expressions. A whisper of fear had entered their collective mind, as if the universe itself was reminding them that even the smallest spark can ignite a raging fire. Bodies fell in a grim pattern. The first man to reach the rock outcropping toppled with a suddenness that made the next in line stumble. The chaos multiplied with every swing of the civilian's arm, every careful squeeze of the trigger. A soldier screamed, another cursed, another froze in place, unsure whether to advance or retreat. In those moments, time seemed suspended, as if the battlefield itself were holding its breath. The civilian moved with a grace born of desperation, sliding behind a jutting boulder, then pivoting to take another shot. His movements were small, almost unnoticeable, yet devastatingly effective. Each bullet was a story, each life halted by a man no one believed could influence the tide of war. And still, the wave pressed forward, immense, screaming, dangerous, yet no longer unstoppable. By now, the enemy's formation had begun to fracture. Lines once solid and impenetrable now wavered, staggering as soldiers glanced at each other, fear and disbelief etched into every face. They had been trained to obey, to charge, to overwhelm. But they had never been taught to fight against the impossible, a single, ordinary civilian wielding a gun that should have been meaningless. The shock, the hesitation, the terror, these became as lethal as any weapon. The civilian sensed the shift, understood its value. Every second he held them at bay. Every body that fell, every pause in the charge was another triumph, another testament to the extraordinary potential of human courage. And then came the moment that would be etched into memory, the one that would define the legend. A soldier, the tallest of them all, with eyes blazing and bayonet fixed, surged forward. The embodiment of the Banzai charge itself. The civilian's heart jumped into his throat. He aimed, fired, and the world seemed to slow. The bullet found its mark perfectly, toppling the soldier like a tree cut at its base. Around him, the ripple spread hesitation, fear, confusion. The wave of 3,000 was still there, still moving, still deadly. But the rhythm had been broken, the tide had been disrupted. The civilian had done the impossible, he had made the unstoppable hesitate. And in that hesitation lay the seeds of survival, the spark of hope, and the proof that courage, no matter how small or unassuming, could change the course of history. Amid the roar of gunfire, the clatter of rifles, and the screams that pierced the humid morning air, the civilian moved with a calculated urgency that belied his ordinary appearance. The battlefield was a chaotic blur of motion. Soldiers tumbling, dust and debris swirling, bayonets glinting in the sunlight. But he saw patterns within the chaos, rhythms that allowed him to survive where others would have fallen. Every movement was deliberate, every step measured. He darted from one makeshift cover to another, a phantom navigating the fractured terrain with a precision that seemed almost preternatural. Fallen logs, jagged rocks, dense underbrush, these were no longer mere obstacles. They were his allies, forming a latticework of protection that allowed him to stay one step ahead of the relentless charge. Each swing of his arm, each squeeze of the trigger, was choreographed with instinctive timing, as though the battlefield itself had whispered its secrets to him. The enemy pressed forward in tight formations, a wave of fury and discipline, their confidence palpable, their numbers seemingly endless. Yet the civilians' presence was a disruption, a jolt in their carefully rehearsed advance. He fired from behind a fallen tree, the small gun cracking sharply against the background of chaos. A soldier lunged forward and froze mid-step as the bullet struck, staggering him backward into the mud. Another fell with a sharp cry, his bayonet hitting the ground with a metallic clang. The rhythm of the Banzai charge, once so relentless, so predictable, had been fractured by a single, ordinary man wielding a weapon that the world had dismissed as insignificant, and in that fracture, hesitation took root. The soldiers exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes, a subtle recognition that they had underestimated the power of resolve, courage, and timing. As he moved, the civilian's senses sharpened. The scent of wet earth, sweat, and gunpowder was thick in his lungs. The sunlight filtering through the dense canopy above cast shifting shadows across the battlefield, shadows that he used to his advantage, weaving between light and dark like a ghost. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every faint footfall became a signal, an opportunity to anticipate the enemy's movement and respond before they could close the distance. His small firearm, though inadequate in size, became an extension of his will, each shot delivering maximum effect because it was paired with impeccable timing. The soldiers in the front lines faltered again, this time exchanging anxious murmurs, some glancing over their shoulders, others glancing at their fallen comrades. Confusion spread, a slow, creeping poison that eroded the unity of the massive wave. The terrain itself seemed to bend to his advantage. Fallen tree trunks became barricades, uneven ridges became vantage points, and pockets of dense undergrowth offered fleeting sanctuary. Each cover point he used was calculated to give him a clear line of sight without exposing himself unnecessarily. He moved with a fluidity born of desperation, but also of instinct honed by the urgency of survival. Each bullet fired was precise, each retreat, each advance a careful negotiation with fate. He understood that a single misstep could mean death, yet he moved with a confidence that suggested an almost intimate knowledge of the battlefield's contours. Behind him, the tide of soldiers pressed forward, their numbers intimidating, their momentum threatening, yet each pause, each stagger caused by his intervention became a ripple of disruption. The psychological impact on the soldiers was profound. They had trained for months, even years, in perfect discipline, drilled to obey, drilled to advance without question. But none had prepared for a lone figure, fragile and unassuming, standing in their path, impervious to fear, unflinching in the face of chaos. Doubt crept into their ranks. A soldier who might have charged without hesitation now hesitated mid-stride. Another faltered, unsure whether to continue or fall back. The civilian became not merely a physical barrier, but a psychological one, an unexpected anomaly in a world governed by rules and order. His mere presence forced the enemy to reconsider their strategy, to weigh risk against the potential cost of advancing. Time became elastic on that battlefield. Seconds stretched into eternity as the civilian fired, ducked, pivoted, and advanced. The wave of soldiers, once a monolithic force, began to ripple and break in small, almost imperceptible ways. The coordinated momentum that had carried them forward now wavered, disrupted by the combination of terrain, precision, and sheer audacity. Every shot fired, every movement made, reinforced the growing realization among the enemy that they were not invincible, that even the smallest force could reshape the battlefield. The jungle itself seemed to participate in the struggle, the shadows deepening in some places, light filtering through the canopy in others, creating visual confusion that aided the civilian's movements and made him appear, at times, almost supernatural. And yet, his mind remained remarkably clear. There was no panic, only a heightened focus, a clarity born of the necessity of survival. He anticipated patterns in the soldiers' advance, predicting their next movements, adjusting his position to maximize effect and minimize risk. The soundscape was overwhelming, cries, gunfire, snapping branches, but he filtered it, passing out the signals that mattered. Each shot became a conversation, each movement a negotiation with fate, each fallen enemy a testament to the effectiveness of precision and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. As the minutes stretched on, the effect on the Banzai charge became undeniable. The once unstoppable wave of 3,000 soldiers now showed visible signs of disruption. Lines that had been straight and rigid now wavered. Soldiers glanced at one another with unspoken questions, eyes wide with disbelief. The civilian, armed only with a small, insignificant gun, had become the pivot upon which the charge now teetered. Every step he took, every shot he fired, amplified the ripple of hesitation. The fear he had instilled, subtle at first, had now metastasized into a tangible obstacle. The battlefield had become a dynamic chessboard, and he was both player and piece, moving with intuition, calculating risk, exploiting terrain, and mastering the rhythm of combat in a way no one could have expected. The enemy's confidence eroded further with each passing moment. Soldiers who had been shouting commands now found their voices faltering. The coordinated scream of 1,000 men had become fragmented, punctuated by stumbles, hesitations, and the occasional curse of disbelief. The civilian's small gun had become a symbol of resistance, an improbable tool wielded with extraordinary effect. Finally, as the sun rose higher in the sky, The pattern became clear. The charge was no longer a single. It was fractured, segmented, disoriented. The civilian had accomplished what seemed impossible. Against overwhelming numbers, he had imposed order upon chaos, timing upon frenzy, precision upon a storm of violence. The first wave that had threatened to crush everything in its path had now been delayed, disoriented, and shaken by a single, ordinary man who had refused to yield. His courage, cunning, and calculated movement had transformed the battlefield into a space where one person's skill, strategy, and bravery could outmatch thousands of disciplined soldiers. The civilian, still crouched behind a fallen tree, glanced briefly at the advancing soldiers, noting the hesitation, the cracks in their formations, the subtle shifts in their momentum. He was exhausted, every muscle screaming, every nerve stretched taut. But he had done the impossible. One man, armed with a too small gun, had disrupted an unstoppable wave. The battlefield, for the first time that day, seemed to acknowledge his triumph. Dust hung in the air like a veil, sunlight dappled the jungle floor, and the cries of the advancing soldiers were punctuated by uncertainty and fear. He had survived the first wave, and in doing so, he had rewritten what was possible in the minds of everyone who had underestimated him. The jungle had fallen eerily quiet. The thunder of boots that had once shaken the ground was now a distant, broken echo. Smoke drifted lazily through the humid air, curling between the trees like ghostly ribbons. The sun, now high above the canopy, poured down a hard, golden light that cut through the haze and illuminated the battlefield below. What had been chaos an hour ago was now a haunting tableau of silence and aftermath. Bodies lay scattered across the uneven terrain, uniforms torn, rifles dropped mid-charge, bayonets glinting uselessly in the soil. And in the midst of it all stood the civilian, his small weapon hanging loosely at his side, his breath heavy, his clothes torn, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. The impossible had happened. For a long moment he couldn't move. His mind was a fog of disbelief. The noise, the screaming, the pounding rhythm of war had been replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to vibrate in his chest. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. The weapon that the military had called too small, a gun meant for little more than practice, had become the tool through which 3,000 men had been halted. Around him, the earth told the story. Shattered helmets, empty magazines, and footprints that went nowhere painted the ground with the evidence of a battle that shouldn't have been won. Not by him, not by anyone like him. He looked toward the ridge from which the enemy had come. Smoke still rose from the grass there, the remnants of grenades and gunfire marking the path of their charge. A few scattered survivors stumbled away into the jungle, dazed and broken, their confidence shattered. He watched them go, not with hatred, but with a distant, numbed awe. They had been an unstoppable force, a single body of roaring, trained men, and he had been one untrained civilian with nothing but nerve and a sidearm. The contrast was almost absurd, and yet it had happened. He had lived through it. His legs ached as he took a few slow steps forward, the ground crunching softly beneath his boots. Every detail was suddenly amplified, the chirp of insects returning to life after the gunfire, the faint rustle of leaves, the drip of sweat from his chin onto the dirt. His hearing, once overwhelmed by the chaos of combat, now registered everything in perfect, excruciating detail. The human body, it seemed, could not instantly forget the rhythm of survival. His finger still twitched unconsciously against the trigger guard. Even though the magazine was long empty, he paused beside a fallen soldier. The man's eyes were open, frozen in an expression of shock. A bayonet lay beside him, half buried in the mud. The civilian crouched down for a moment, staring at the weapon, then at his own. The little gun that had seemed so inadequate at the start. In that moment, the absurdity of war crystallized in his mind. Power, he realized, was not always a matter of size or firepower or training. It was belief, the refusal to surrender, even when logic demanded it. That was what had carried him through. The silence stretched on. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of the ocean glimmering through the trees. For the first time since the chaos began, he allowed himself to exhale fully. The air tasted of salt, smoke, and victory, bittersweet, heavy, almost unreal. He holstered the weapon and straightened, his posture slow and weary but proud. The ridge, the trees, the fallen, all bore witness to a truth that would outlast the day. Courage, even when isolated and small, could shape history. As the minutes passed, distant sounds began to emerge, the echo of engines, shouts, the crackle of radios, reinforcements. American soldiers were approaching, moving cautiously through the jungle, rifles raised, expecting an ambush. When they reached the clearing, they froze. The scene before them was unlike anything they had imagined. The bodies of hundreds of enemy soldiers lay strewn across the battlefield, weapons scattered, formation shattered. And at the center stood one man, dirt-streaked, trembling, utterly human, and impossibly alive. The first soldier to speak did so in disbelief. What the hell happened here? The civilian turned slowly toward the sound. His face was unreadable, his voice barely above a whisper. "They charged," he said, pausing to wipe the sweat from his brow, "and I stopped them." There was no arrogance in his tone, no pride, only exhaustion and quiet truth. The reinforcements looked around, trying to piece together what they were seeing. Some muttered prayers, others just stared in stunned silence. The absurdity of it all seemed to defy comprehension. 3,000 men, stopped by one, a man with no military rank, no orders, no official weapon. Just will. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Within hours, the story had traveled up the chain of command, distorted and amplified in retelling. By evening, the civilian's act of defiance had already begun to take on the shape of legend. Some said he had hidden behind a fortress of rocks. Others claimed he had single-handedly destroyed an entire platoon with strategic brilliance. But the truth was simpler and greater. He had done what no one else would have believed possible. He had faced the impossible and refused to yield. As the day waned, the sunlight began to fade into amber hues, washing the battlefield in gold. The reinforcements worked quietly, gathering the wounded, collecting weapons, and securing the perimeter. The civilian helped where he could, though every movement felt heavy, slow. His body was exhausted, but his mind remained alert, as if afraid that the silence was merely a trick, that the enemy might come roaring back at any second. But the jungle remained still. The danger had passed. The war, at least his part in it, was over. When night finally fell, campfires flickered to life across the clearing. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, some glancing occasionally toward the man who had defied the storm. He sat a little apart from them, staring at the stars that glimmered faintly through the canopy. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the deep lines of fatigue and resolve. He wasn't a soldier, yet in that moment, Every man around him knew he had embodied the truest essence of one. The commanding officer approached quietly, sitting beside him without speaking at first. The two men stared into the fire for a while, the silence between them carrying more meaning than words could. Finally, the officer spoke. "They told me you stopped the charge." The civilian nodded slightly. "I just did what I had to. That's not something most men could have done." He shrugged. "Maybe. But someone had to stand." The officer regarded him thoughtfully, then extended his hand. The gesture was simple, but heavy with respect. "You did more than stand," he said. "You reminded all of us what it means to fight." The civilian accepted the handshake. Though his gaze remained fixed on the fire, he didn't see himself as a hero. In his mind, he had merely survived. But the world around him had already begun to shape his story into something larger than life. And perhaps that was how history worked. Ordinary men doing extraordinary things in moments that demanded it, forever remembered not for their perfection, but for their defiance. The night deepened, and the sounds of the jungle grew louder. Crickets, distant waves, the sighing of wind through leaves. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the exhaustion finally wash over him. Tomorrow the war would continue elsewhere. New battles, new stories. But this small patch of earth, marked by courage and chaos, would remain forever silent, sacred in its own strange way. In the years that would follow, soldiers and civilians alike would hear the story and wonder how it could be true. How one ordinary man with a too small gun could stand against an army of thousands. Some would call it luck. Others would call it divine intervention. But those who understood war, truly understood it, would recognize something deeper. It was not luck. It was not divine. It was the raw, unfiltered power of human will, that strange, immovable force that refuses to bow even before the impossible. And so the legend grew. The island, once a nameless battleground, became a symbol of defiance. The civilian's weapon, preserved later in a small museum case, would draw countless eyes. Visitors would stand before it in disbelief, staring at the tiny firearm that had defied an empire. Beneath it, a single plaque bore an inscription: "Courage is not measured in calibers." Generations would pass. The war would fade into the pages of history, but his story would endure. Whispered by veterans, retold by historians, reimagined by filmmakers. Each version would differ in detail, but the heart of it would remain unchanged: an ordinary man, standing alone, choosing not to yield when all logic said he should. In the end, that was the truth of it. The gun had been small, the man had been ordinary, but courage was limitless.